We have been working on making our upstairs loft area into just a really cozy hangout space. A little while after we moved in, we added an electric fireplace, which you can check out that video in the description box. And for our latest project, we decided that we needed to add a cool little mini kitchen / wet bar area. To save time and money, we went to Ikea, we got a stock cabinet, and we turned it from this into this. Let's go see how we did it.
This video is sponsored by Kreg Tool.
This is a 48-inch Ikea Besta cabinet. We installed it when we initially moved in just to cover up the plumbing that is in the wall. To get the dimensions we needed, we actually stacked 2 of the units together and then added feet. As you can see, they have these really dumb horizontal doors. In this setup, gravity's working against us and they are constantly out of alignment. So I'm gonna swap these out and make my own walnut doors that match our laundry room and kitchen. They'll run vertically, so they should hang a lot straighter. I need to create a countertop to go over my cabinets. The plan is to make it out of solid poplar because I have a lot of solid poplar throughout my house and I want it to match. Yeah, I know, hardwood guys, come at me. Poplar is a relatively soft wood, but it will be fine for our application. The countertop with the Waterfall will be about 9 feet long, and I need it to be 17 inches wide. Finding boards that are 17 inches wide, especially straight and flat at 17 inches wide, is pretty rare. So what I'm going to do is laminate a bunch of smaller boards together to get my 17-inch width. Laminating is just a fancy word for gluing boards side by side. Although the countertop is 17 inches wide, my thickness planer that I'm going to run the boards through to smooth them all the way out is only 12 inches wide. So I'm gonna glue up the countertop in 2 separate panels. Then I will run each panel through my thickness planer at the same setting and then join those 2 bigger panels together.
If this is the first time you've watched a Pneumatic Addict video, I want to say welcome. I'm glad you're here. Take a second to make sure you hit that subscribe button and bell down below. That way you'll never miss one of my DIY projects. Once both sides of both boards were planed, I started thinking about how I was going to join them together.
This is the new MortiseMate by Kreg Tool. It gives you a really simple way to create a mortise or pocket inside your wood that will accommodate a loose or floating tenon. Mortise and tenon joinery has been around forever, and it's one of your strongest options for joining 2 pieces of wood together. The new MortiseMate jig makes mortise and tenon joinery approachable even for a beginner woodworker. The whole kit comes with a plywood mini work surface. It has these notches to accommodate clamps, but the jig itself is made out of solid heavy-duty aluminum. There is a lot going on with this jig, and I'll be honest, when I first took it out of the box, I was a little bit intimidated. There's lots of gears and springs and a handle, but it only took me a couple of minutes to get set up and mounted to my workbench. And then I immediately realized that the use is really, really simple. It literally only takes a few seconds to learn how to use it. You'll notice up top, it has a dust collection port that can be hooked up to your dust extractor or even a shop vac. On the bottom side of the jig, there is a depth adjustment. You can use the MortiseMate on material as thin as 1/2 inch or as thick as 1 3/4 inches. And this collar right here is where all the action happens.
You insert the cutter bit with a stop collar into any cordless drill. Then, once the bit is inserted into the collet and pressure is applied, you can toggle the handle back and forth, which allows a ratcheting gear to progress the bit forward little bit at a time. By the time the bit bottoms out on the stop collar, you've drilled out a perfectly sized mortise.
The cutter bit size coordinates with the size of tenon you're going to use. So on thinner material, for example, you're going to want to use the 6mm tenons. You would use a 6mm cutter bit. The other sizes available are 8mm and 10mm, which is what I plan on using on my Waterfall top.
I aligned my 2 countertop boards face up next to each other on my work surface and began marking the locations for my joinery. With the MortiseMate mounted to my workbench, it was easy to work even on this long 9-foot board. I can't imagine how long it would have taken me if I tried to cut these mortises by hand. It's best to leave just a tiny bit of wiggle room to accommodate for the combination of errors across each connection point. That's why most joinery cutting systems, including the MortiseMate, allow for micro adjustment of the size of the pocket that you cut.
All right, We've got everything lined up. It's time for glue up, the most stressful part of any lamination process. I'm going to apply a healthy amount of weldwood wood glue to the joint and make sure that I get it inside those mortises as well as the floating tenons.
The next morning, I removed the clamps from the countertop and measured the two pieces that would come together to create an L shape. I believe a 45-degree angle cut across the face of a board is technically a bevel, not a miter, but you understand what I mean.
It is time to make that tricky waterfall miter cut for the end of my countertop. For me, I think the easiest option is to use my Kreg ACS or adaptive cutting system. It's basically a heavy-duty work surface with a built-in track and a plungeable track saw, and is a great way to make very accurate, large cuts.
After making my first cross cut, I pulled out the countertop, flipped it over, and reinserted it under my track. I then made my second cut, which is perpendicular to the first one, removing a little equilateral wedge from the underside of the countertop.
Before I glue that waterfall miter up, I want to cut the square end on the opposite side of the countertop. In general, miters are not super strong joints and you typically want to add some reinforcement. In this case, I am going to use glue only on my miter, and that's only because I have a unique application. The vertical load of this side panel is going to be supported by screws driven from the inside of my cabinet. There should be no real flexing or stress on this joint. The miter is just cosmetic. So for me, I'm saving myself a lot of time and aggravation skipping the joinery and just using glue and really focusing on making this joint look pretty. If I was going to create a waterfall edge for a functional piece of furniture like I did on my new desk that I built for my office, I definitely wouldn't just rely on glue. Check out that video if you want to see how I created that joint. I'll leave the link in the description box.
I was able to easily sand out the small seam I had from gluing the two boards together.
I still need to do some work to the countertop before it's going to get installed. And as I mentioned before, just a glued miter joint's not super strong. So to protect the joint while I'm sanding and moving it up the stairs, things like that, I'm going to attach a few of these Simpson Strong Tie A23 right angles that I happen to have. They're little 90-degree metal brackets that I'm going to screw to the inside, just temporarily. And when it's time to finally install my countertop, I'll remove them and attach the countertop to the cabinet base, giving it some more support. Time to apply my finish. For the countertop, I am using a water-based spar urethane. Typically on a countertop that might see some occasional splashes of water, I would recommend an oil-based or epoxy-based finish, but since I'm using poplar specifically, I want to keep it as blonde as possible. Spar urethane is often used as an outdoor finish, so like to coat your front door or outdoor furniture, and it provides pretty good protection against water. Choosing to go with a water-based spar urethane will probably reduce my water resistance a little bit, but it will help keep the pale poplar blonde and prevent yellowing. If I were to do wood countertops like in a kitchen that's going to see water and wiping down all the time, I would preference water resistance, go with an oil-based finish, and just accept the fact that I'm going to have a little bit of yellowing. I'm applying the spar urethane using my very beloved HVLP. I use one from Fuji Spray, and it's the best way to get a perfectly even professional looking finish in my opinion.
In total, I think I sprayed 4 coats of the spar urethane.
Time to start building my cabinet doors. A lot of you will not like this, but the key to really nice flat panel doors is MDF, medium density fiberboard. I know. I was like you when I first started shopping around for flat panel doors for our house. I wanted solid wood. But after lots of research and talking to a couple of my friends who make cabinets, I discovered that large flat panels of wood, especially when they're thin enough to be a cabinet door, are not your best option. Solid wood, even hardwoods, when you get them that thin, tend to want to cup or warp over time. So if you go into a modern house and they have flat panel doors, even if it is a multi-million-dollar house, I will bet you money that inside the core of those flat panel doors is MDF. Unlike natural wood that expands and contracts with humidity, MDF will always stay the same dimension. So your best option for beautiful wood flat panel doors is to have a stable MDF core and then apply a solid wood veneer to the outside. I'm going to show you, in my opinion, the best way to make a high quality wood veneered MDF flat panel door. I have here a piece of 5/8 thick MDF that I purchased at my local Home Depot. I've already cut the height of my doors, which is around 29.5 inches, using a circular saw and an edge guide. Now I'm over at my table saw and I am going to rip this larger piece into 4 individual doors, giving me my 11 3/4 inch width.
If you often work with sheet goods like MDF or plywood, I highly recommend you pick yourself up a Kreg panel carrier. It's the only thing that makes it possible for me to be able to move a full sheet around my workshop.
I have my MDF panels cut down to size, and I intentionally cut them a little bit smaller than I want for my finished door size. That's because I need to address these edges. The goal is to make this door look as much like solid wood as possible. That means I need to put an edge banding around the narrow sides. There's different types of edge banding that you can apply. I often do the iron-on kind, but since I want these doors to be super durable, super strong, and really nice, I'm actually gonna go with solid hardwood edge banding. I also happen to have some walnut on hand, so I decided let's use it. To make the edge banding, I am going to rip some of my wider boards of walnut down to about 1/4 inch thin strips. I can then apply those to the outside edge of my door.
To create the prettiest looking joints possible, I used my miter saw to miter the edge banding. I then used wood glue and a boatload of clamps to attach the edge banding to the entire perimeter of each panel and hold it in place while the glue dried.
All my edge banding is dry, and if you were paying attention, you'll notice that my MDF panels are 5/8 of an inch thick, but my edge banding was 3/4 of an inch wide. That means I have an 1/8 of an inch overhang that I need to address. I could use a flush trim router bit to trim that down smooth, but the much faster option is going to be to use my table saw. I used a scrap piece of MDF to set the fence on my table saw, and now I'm going to carefully run all 4 edges of each panel, very carefully trimming off that little 1/8 of an inch overhang.
I definitely recommend using a vertical jig or tenoning jig to make this type of cut much safer.
This next step is the key to making my MDF look like beautiful solid walnut. I ordered a bunch of walnut veneer online, and I was feeling a little bit lazy, so I got the kind with the 3M adhesive already applied to the back. Traditionally, you apply veneer to your substrate using contact adhesive or contact cement. I've used that technique a couple of times, like when I made my kitchen table and when I made walnut paneling for my laundry room makeover. You can check out the link in the description for those videos if you want to see the more traditional application. First thing I have to do is to cut it into 8 distinct pieces to get it ready to apply to my MDF. You can use a lot of different tools to cut it down, but one of the easiest ways is just a sharp utility knife. Time to start applying my veneer. It's something that's easier to do with an extra hand, so I recruited my husband Bryce. He's gonna come over and help me pull the backing while I stick the veneer to the cabinet door. It's a pretty straightforward process. I just need one tool. This is called a J roller. This is gonna help me apply even, heavy downward pressure to make sure that I don't get any air bubbles as we work our way down attaching the veneer.
I then flipped each panel over and carefully used a utility knife to trim off the excess veneer around the perimeter. At this point, my doors needed a nice light sanding, mostly just to smooth sharp edges.
So normally when I am installing concealed hinges, I mount them to the back of my cabinet door first, and then I move the doors in place onto the cabinet and attach them that way. It makes the alignment much easier. But because the mounting holes for these specific concealed hinges are already drilled and attached to this cabinet, I want to try to maintain those. That means I have to install my hinges backwards. They're already on the cabinet. So I need to mark the location on the backs of my doors now. Marking the hinge location on the back of the door is going to be a little tricky. So I grabbed a Kreg cabinet door mounting jig and attached it to the bottom of my cabinet just using a clamp. It will function as a third hand holding the cabinet door while I reach in and mark the location of the hinges. To make sure I don't screw up these mortises, I am using this guy. This is a concealed hinge jig made by Kreg. It's super simple to use. You have a base plate, and then you have this little cup with your 1 3/8" Forstner bit that securely lock into the base plate.
After you drill the cup for the main body of the hinge, the jig also helps you drill 2 small pilot holes for the screws that will hold the hinge in place. Luckily, once the mortises were drilled for the first door, all I had to do was translate that location to the other 3 doors.
With the countertop, I want to keep it as blonde and light as possible, but with walnut, it really shines when it has a little bit of warmth, a little bit of amber tones to kind of magnify that grain. So the first thing I'm doing is applying a coat of sanding sealer, which is basically just shellac without wax in it. Shellac is great at popping the grain of the wood and making those warm honey amber colors really shine.
After the shellac, I sprayed on 3 coats of a satin sheen lacquer. Even though it's super stinky and kind of a pain to clean up, I absolutely love lacquer. It dries super fast and leaves a very professional looking finish.
The countertop will be fully supported by the cabinet. Just to give the floating end a little bit more support, I'm going to use this 90-degree bracket. In all honesty, it's probably overkill, but I have it, and once it's installed, you won't see it back behind the mini fridge. We're getting ready to bring the countertop and get it installed, which means I need to pre-drill through the top of my IKEA cabinet so I can drive the screws up from underneath. If you know anything about natural wood, you know that with weather, time, humidity, wood's going to expand and contract, which means it's going to need to move a little bit to avoid cracking and splitting. Simplest way to allow for this is to just drill a slightly oversized hole in the cabinet and then drive my screws with washers up from underneath into the wood. If the wood decides it needs to spread or move, the countertop will be able to move ever so slightly within those oversized holes. If I didn't do this, there's a good chance the wood movement would end up pulling my laminated boards apart over time. I have my sink opening marked out and it is time to cut it. I've spent the last several days laminating, gluing, sanding, and finishing this countertop, so I really don't want to screw it up. I've marked out a 14-inch square using the template that was provided from the sink manufacturer. And I applied painter's tape not only to make my markings, but the tape will also help give me a little bit cleaner cut and prevent the finish from scratching. So the first thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to use a 3/8 inch drill bit to drill inside all 4 corners of my square. I then can insert a jigsaw blade to cut the left and right and the front edge. Unfortunately, the back edge is too close to the wall to fit my jigsaw blade. So there, I'm going to have to use a 6.5 inch circular saw blade so I can get a little bit closer to the wall. Plunge cutting with a circular saw can be a little bit tricky, so I don't recommend you trying that if you don't know what you're doing.
I'm normally not a huge jigsaw fan, but this is one of the very few circumstances that it's perfect for.
I covered a piece of 1/8 inch thick hardboard with some leftover walnut veneer and went ahead and applied some of that same clear lacquer that I used on the cabinet doors. Now I'm just going to slide it in place and attach it with a few 18 gauge brad nails. I'm going to use more of that waterproof spar urethane and brush on a couple of good heavy coats on that exposed edge of the sink opening that I just cut.
We were originally going to purchase a used mini fridge, but I found a really pretty glass front one on Amazon for a great price that fits the shallow dimensions of the countertop perfectly. We attached the faucet, drain, and downspout to the sink, and then carefully placed it in the opening in the countertop so we could mark a location to drill a 2-inch hole to allow the plumbing to run.
When we were building our house, we had our plumber run rough-in water lines into this cabinet. So we have a hot and a cold water line as well as a waste drain. We went ahead and shut off the main water supply to the house, and now it's time to cut these lines and add shutoff valves.
We used quarter-turn push connection valves to hook up the hot and cold water lines. Unlike other types of valves, these ones don't require any special tools.
So we have our waste line, our PVC all dry fit, and we know that's gonna work. We turn the water back on and our water supply lines are working great, valves are holding. So now it's time to drop our sink into the opening. To help hold our sink in place as well as create that waterproof seal that we really want to get, before we drop the sink in, I'm going to apply a bead all around the perimeter using some Quick Seal Ultra by DAP. It's a silicone-based sealant, but it cleans up with soap and water and is 100% waterproof once it sets up.
Once the sink was securely pressed in place, I added a bead of caulk around the entire seam just to make sure we didn't have any water try to seep in. To get the absolutely cleanest caulk line possible, I recommend applying 2 strips of painter's tape, which you immediately remove after spreading the caulk. I reattached the cabinet doors, and the last thing to do was to add the cabinet door hardware. We went with the same top-mounted tab pulls that we have throughout the rest of our house. Ready to see how our new mini kitchen turned out? You might notice I added a few poplar floating shelves as well. If you want to learn more about those, I recommend you check out either my laundry makeover video or our kitchen episode in our Building Modern on a Budget series. All the projects I've mentioned, as well as the products that I used, will be linked in the description box below. I think we're ready to invite some friends over and have a movie night. My teenage sons have been begging me to add a microwave so they can make popcorn while they're up here, but since this loft is the only carpeted room in our house, we'll see. What do you think of the two-tone wood look? Make sure you leave any questions in the comments down below. If you want to see the rest of the modern house that we built ourselves, I recommend you check out the whole Building Modern on a Budget series. And if you like other types of DIY content, check out this video as well. Thanks for watching, guys.